It is possible to travel the whole world in search of one who is more worthy of compassion than oneself. No such person can be found. It would not be true to say that the cultivation of loving kindness and compassion is part of our practice. It would be true to say that the cultivation of loving kindness and compassion is all of our practice. Tonight's talk continues the theme of compassion, and more specifically, our summer theme of bringing the Dharma to life. And sometimes compassion is referred to as the jewel in the lotus. And the lotus symbolizes the heart or mind that blossoms into freedom. And the jewel in the center represents the compassion in the center of the blossom, which is a source of wealth and happiness. Last week I spoke a little bit about compassion, of how it's an integral part of the Buddha's four heart teachings, the Brahmaviharas. And just as a reminder, loving kindness or goodwill is the foundation. Compassion is the response to what goodwill feels when it's encountering suffering. Empathetic joy wants happiness to continue. Equanimity might be seen as a support or a safeguard that allows goodwill to be focused and effective. And the Buddha taught that the sincere practice of inquiry leads to this inner experience of freedom, and that compassion and loving kindness are states that just arise naturally from that freedom. Similarly, another wise teacher, Jesus, taught, love thy neighbor as thyself, not as a burdensome duty, but as a path of joy that connects us to one another through that which is divine in all of us. Here's something else that the Buddha said about the four boundless qualities. This one, he said this about all four of them, but this one is about compassion. A monk dwells, pervading one quarter with a mind imbued with compassion. Likewise the second quarter, likewise the third, likewise the fourth. So above, below, around, and everywhere, and to all as to himself, he dwells, pervading the all-encompassing world with a mind imbued with compassion, abundant, exalted, immeasurable, without hostility and without ill will. When the liberation of mind by compassion is developed in this way, no limiting action remains there, none persists there. Just as a vigorous trumpeter could make himself heard without difficulty in four quarters, so too when the liberation of mind by compassion is developed in this way, no limiting action remains. None persists there. So a rather lofty intention, right? To dwell pervading the all-encompassing world with a mind imbued with compassion. How do we develop this mind imbued with compassion and remove the obstacles for our feeling compassionate? And last week we mentioned about the need to see the suffering in ourselves and in the world without taking it so personally. And this is a tall order, particularly when we are witnessing or experiencing oppression, racism, violence. If, when we take it personally, it's easy to become depressed, overwhelmed, or to feel burdened. What's needed is to feel empathy without it touching or grabbing hold of our own fears, our attachments, and perhaps our unresolved grief. We begin to understand that to feel true compassion for others, we have to start with our own suffering. We have to understand our own suffering. Sometimes we see our suffering as faults. We believe that the faults define us. I was remembering Jeff's talk on shame when we talked about some of the thoughts we hold about ourselves. But it's important that we hold those faults in a context of compassionate love for ourselves. Because on a spiritual path, we don't create our identity based on our faults. Instead, we acknowledge our shortcomings, this being human, and we're able to see the harm that's caused by these shortcomings to ourselves and to others. We empathically hold both parts of ourselves, the self that regrets a past action and the self that took that action in the first place. And one of the best ways for seeing into our suffering a little bit more clearly is this practice of insight. We mindfully observe the roots of our suffering: anger, fear, attachment. And just this looking, just this noticing begins to loosen those roots a little bit. So we give ourselves time on the cushion or in the chair or lying down or a walking practice. And we give ourselves time to process grim events or experiences, challenging experiences, and to let the difficult emotions move through us. So, for example, let's say that you recognize from an experience that anger is present. If you look into that anger, you might be able to see some of its roots: a misunderstanding, a clumsiness, injustice, resentment, or conditioning. And these roots can be present in ourselves as well as in the person who played the principal role in precipitating your anger. Seeing and understanding are the elements of liberation that bring about love and compassion. Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a teacher from Vietnam, gives us a metaphor for this process. He says, we can't eat raw potatoes, but we don't throw them out just because they're raw. We put them in a pot of water, put a lid on, put the pot on a fire. The fire is mindfulness, the practice of breathing consciously and focusing on our anger. The lid represents our concentration, because we need something to prevent the heat from going out of the pot. We have to pay attention. There needs to be some concentration. And when we're practicing like this, looking into our anger, we need to keep the concentration there, hence the practice. As soon as we put the pot on the fire, change begins to occur. The water warms up. 10 minutes later it boils, but we have to keep the fire, our mindfulness, going a while longer in order to cook the potatoes. So we turn towards, we stay with whatever's arising, allowing bubbles of sensations or emotions to rise up. And as we practice being aware of our breathing, our anger, a transformation is beginning to occur. Anger transforms into another kind of energy with some understanding, some compassion. We start to see habitual reactivity, the ways in which we respond when such a thing is present, like anger. And in our meditation practice, the silence slowly mixes our feelings, our various mood states, our beliefs, whatever's arising, our thoughts, into a soft, pliable presence. It takes time for this heating process to work. But it doesn't matter if your mind is restless or constantly wandering, or your body is in some pain, or you are filled with doubt. All of these reactions are just fuel for the practice, for your work on the cushion. And this practice can become the motivation to develop an inner life so that even the bad moments aren't wasted. They're used as spiritual fuel. And moreover, in fully opening to what's present, whatever's arising, some compassion can be evoked, which is the appropriate response to suffering, no matter its origin. We might say that opening fully to our experience is a kind of fearlessness. It means the courage not to turn away from, but to go towards. And David Whyte, a poet from the British Isles, writes about this in a poem. He says, "Those who will not slip beneath the still surface on the well of grief, turning down to its black water, to the place we cannot breathe, will never know the source from which we drink, the secret water cold and clear, nor find in the darkness the small gold coins thrown by those who wished for something else." The well-being of those who wished for something else is our well-being. We can only embrace others, ourselves and others, when we have noticed and accepted the same qualities in others that we no longer despise in ourselves. So living with anger, resentment, or alienation, to stay there roots us in some despair. So you don't have to be a saint to find grace and the transformative power of compassion. You only have to be willing to pay attention. What is your experience? What is the experience of this body, this suffering? And what are its causes? What are you seeing as you look fully? The purpose of loving kindness and compassion practices is to cultivate the intention to embrace all parts of yourself, to overcome feelings of separation from yourself and from others. So we've all had this experience of feeling like we failed miserably, or maybe you haven't, or feeling hopelessly inadequate in regards to something or someone you deeply cared for. Maybe you even have to live with the devastation that comes from an irredeemable loss caused by a mistake you made, or with the consequences of cruelty by another. What you may not have noticed is how you organize inside in reaction to the losses or the failures or the sense of great mistakes. Because sometimes this inner experience is very subtle. It's a little more quiet than all the noise of big emotions in reaction to an external event. Sometimes we look closely and we discover that we've even maybe rejected the experience as we're feeling it, never fully accepting it to be what it is because we so desperately want something else to be true. So we live with the insistence that the past ought to be other than what it is. That's rather hopeless, but we suffer because of that. And it's this separation from our real emotions that compassion and loving kindness can help us overcome. Sometimes the more painful the feelings are, the more likely you are to hold that experience at bay, not really wanting it to come in so that it can be processed and relinquished. Nor can we let it go because that would first require allowing it to permeate us to whatever degree impact it has for us. So we might separate it from it by becoming angry, restless, judgmental, judging ourselves, judging others, or fantasizing about how we could have done it differently. And we have a tendency to repeat that story again and again, and our experience hardens around that story because the feeling seems so unbearable that to fully let it in seems though it might be to experience something akin to death. And when this happens, we're believing that separating, keeping it at a distance, not letting it in, creates some safety. And in fact, it can do that in some situations, for some people, some of the time. And paradoxically, the opposite can be true. To allow the experience in is to embrace life. Someone wrote, and I didn't find who it is, but this is a quote: "Dancing in the fire means showing up and being willing to recognize that even though this experience can be extremely intense, there is also a lot of space around the experience. No matter how intense the weather is," we're under a severe thunderstorm watch, right, till 9 o'clock tonight, "the nature of the sky remains unaltered. It remains as vast and as limitless as it always has been. So no matter the intensity of the experience arising in your mind, the awareness of that experience, the capacity to see it, the ability to view that experience from different angles can remain unaltered." So this is somewhat of a heady conversation thus far, perhaps. And what I want to say about compassion is that it's an energetic response. It's not a mental idea, although those thoughts, those understandings can give us some information. But compassion arises in the belly, in the body, through the belly and the heart. It's what you might feel if you see a small child fall, scrape a knee. Your natural response might be to pick the child up. Not because the holding makes the injury or the pain go away, but because it provides a kind of comfort that is healing to the spirit of the child. It's exactly in this energetic spirit that you hold yourself when you are fully accepting the truth of your own past experiences. The task is to find the humility and the courage to open to yourself in this manner, and it's not easy. When I was about 11 or 12, my parents had a collie dog that gave birth to a large litter of puppies. And they were all going to be sold, but my sibs and I begged the parents to save one puppy for our family, and they agreed. One Sunday before we went to church, they set up a can of water for the mother dog inside the pen with the pups. And when we came home, we discovered that our chosen puppy was headfirst in the watering can, drowned. In several years, I wrote a verse describing the compassion of my father moments after this incident. That fall, when the puppy drowned, the one we were keeping, I met my father on the path, stopping awkwardly, hugging each other, crying together, no words to plumb the sorrow's depth. We practice, and our capacity for compassion and loving kindness grows. We begin to discover the many nuances of that which we call love. Is love at its heart desire? Is it love when you are feeling, is it love you're feeling when you wish good things for your loved ones? Or is love an unmoving, energetic state from which all else moves, including your good intentions and good wishes? If it's this, then there is a unity of love, sort of an unchanging state that occasionally we're in touch with, other times not so much. T.S. Eliot put it this way in 4 quartets: Desire itself is movement. Love is itself unmoving, only the cause and end of movement. So whenever we're in touch with this unchanging state, feelings of compassion and loving attentions spontaneously arise. You can just notice how that happens in your life. From this perspective, love is always present, empty of form itself, yet present in all forms. It's we who are separated from this love due to our inability to just be with things as they are. As we begin to stay more present, to fully receive the moment just as it is, however it is, we experience more loving intentions, even towards difficult people, because we feel less separation. We can increase this amount of compassion, this feeling of love, if we set an intention to do so. And we can do this in a couple of ways. We can set an intention to be compassionate toward a particular situation or towards a particular individual. Or we can make it more general, compassion for the rest of this night. How would that be? What does that look like? Whenever we're consciously setting an intention, we're more likely to notice compassionate thoughts and impulses that arise. Otherwise, they may be overshadowed by different desires or concerns. And you can also deliberately reflect on compassion by reading about it, talking about it. Read something about it before you go to sleep at night. Because whatever we think about regularly becomes an inclination. It changes the habit life. Spending time with people who are compassionate is inspiring. They have an influence on us. You might even think about recently who you've run into, who you've had a conversation with, who you've spent a little time with and been inspired by their compassion. Compassion is not just a place we visit for a short time and then forget, but it can become an inseparable companion. Yes, we'll forget, and it can become more of a dwelling place where we stay at home. Generally speaking, when compassion grows, our self-centeredness, thinking about this one, and our clinging tend to decrease. Liberation becomes a lot easier. And it works together so that as we become freer, compassion becomes more readily available. They work in tandem. We let compassion and liberation support each other, and it's a gift to the world. So, compassion. We have a little time here, so I'm wondering if you'd like to get together in a little group of 2 or 3 people and just reflect for yourselves on these ideas about compassion in your own life. What you notice, how it is you might stimulate it, support it as a guiding principle. See if you can be inspired by a person sitting next to you. So just find a couple of people to pull your chairs together and speak briefly about compassion. Any thoughts, comments, reflections on what you heard, what you spoke, on awareness or cultivating this practice or working with this? mic is hot. Thank you, Bill.
Okay. We talked a little bit about how many times and every day we have a choice between, compassion, if it is the reaction or the quivering of the heart to suffering, that the first step is to understand or to identify and be with the suffering of others, I suppose also within yourself. And that many times every day we have the choice, when there is suffering around us, to go to throw it aside, to deflect it, or to go towards it. And sometimes our reason for deflecting it is feeling perhaps that, it will bring up in us our own suffering, and therefore we go that direction. However, talking about it together here and thinking about it more often, the opposite happens if you go the other way, where you're open yourself to the suffering of others, even if it's a small amount. Yeah. That opens your heart, and compassion comes naturally. In other words, it's not a forced thing. So really the practice is opening your heart to suffering, and compassion comes along with it.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. What else? Thank you.
I especially liked, during your talk, the illustration of the child who's fallen down and skinned their knees and picking them up, hugging them. It doesn't take words. It doesn't take, oh, I'm sorry, hurt yourself, or anything like that. A hug or even just a look in the eyes is so radiant with compassion that that's all that's needed. And I, of course, visualize this whole thing. So thank you for that illustration.
Thank you.
I'd like to raise a question about the discernment between compassion and our feeling so noble that we might reach out to someone we perceive has something wrong or is less than, if you will. So the question really to ponder and to invite some response to is, it seems sometimes in our wish to be compassionate to someone in a difficult circumstance actually really is not. Mm-hmm. It's saying, I'm better than you are. I'm functioning, stable, whatever that is, and you don't have that. And then that causes more separation than what we're attempting to do, which is to collapse separation through compassion.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the notion of how compassion arises naturally as opposed to kind of a forced compassion that you're speaking of, where that comes up. Yeah. Thoughts on that from anybody? Yeah, David?
So I think as human beings, inevitably, both our honest, open-hearted, and good intentions are real, as well as the other side, that whatever we're doing, to some degree, we're doing it to take care of ourselves. I think to whatever degree it's possible for us to be aware that of our mixed emotions, our mixed motivations, and to recognize it as human, and to let it inform the way we relate to the person that we want to be helpful to. That's my thought.
I think one of my secrets in that scenario is anonymity. So I might offer some act of loving kindness, but I might do it in a way that the other person wouldn't necessarily know.
Thank you. Jeff?
Just a reminder that the near enemy of compassion is pity.
Right.
And to your point, and pity presumes that I'm not suffering and that I'm looking down on you,
Thank
as
you, Jeff.
opposed to shared humanity.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else? Linda?
What I do a lot with, especially a friend of mine who's suffering a lot, or anybody, I'm so sorry. And I'm thinking, is that compassion? Is that pity? Is that sympathy? Is that really helpful? I mean, when people tell me that, I guess maybe compassion. I feel like they care, and that's what I'm trying to say to my friend, I guess. But now I'm thinking maybe that's pity, which you said is the enemy of compassion, right?
The near enemy.
And then or near enemy, and then like she said, it can make me feel superior, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
I never thought of that. But
So we have to look closely at what is arising. What are the thoughts? What are the, as David mentioned, the mixed emotions, the mix that's arising, and just be mindful of that. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
I just wanted to thank you for giving us a chance to kind of process that, because you covered so much in your talk and my mind was kind of spinning, but then you gave us a chance to talk about it right now while it was still fresh, and it really kind of helped anchor it. So I appreciated that.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. All right. Last call. Thank you all for being here tonight, for your practice. We'll see you next week.